Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's DAT Chat on Facebook Live. I'm Josh Katzenstein here with Jeff Duncan, and we figure everyone wants to talk about the NFL schedule that was released yesterday. Wednesday, the NFL did its big 7 p.m. announcement of the schedule, and much to our surprise, there were leaks earlier in the day where some people found out some details about the Saints or some other team schedules. But Jeff, first of all, as always, feel free to submit any questions. It can be about the schedule, the draft, anything else that's on your mind. But we'll start off, Jeff. Just what was your initial impression of the schedule?
Well, like every year, we look at it and we try to determine futilely tough stretches, what could be the make or break part of the schedule for the team, and usually we're terribly wrong.
We're always wrong.
Because you could never tell which teams in the NFL are going to be good from year to year, it seems like. Obviously, the opening stretch playing 4 playoff teams back-to-back to start the season, including the West Coast swing where the Saints have not traditionally had success in Seattle and Los Angeles, kind of a foreign environment for them of late. I think that looks like a tough stretch. The thing that stood out to me and is a little – I put my observations up, so if you're sitting at your computer – you can check it out on NOLA.com. I think a little underrated factor that I'm sure we'll touch on at some point during the season is how many athletic quarterbacks they face this year. And I think that's just a sign of the times in the modern NFL. Mm-hmm. We're seeing more mobile quarterbacks, more guys that can move around the pocket, but the Saints face a bunch of them early on, and Deshaun Watson, Dak Prescott, Russell Wilson, Mitch Trubisky, maybe Kyler Murray. So that I think I'm sure Sean Payton and his staff have thought about. I mean, they've gotten a lot more athletic on defense in the last few years, but they're going to be facing a lot more mobile quarterbacks than they have in recent years. And we've seen the Saints really do well against non-mobile quarterbacks. Mm-hmm. I think they eat those guys up. Not so much for these mobile guys, so I think that's something that maybe a lot of people haven't thought about.
Well, yeah, I mean, week 1, I guess you could sort of think back to the first time they played against Robert Griffin III, that was week 1 against mm-hmm. Washington. Everyone picked the Saints, to win that game at home, and then all of a sudden RG3 ran all over them. And obviously Deshaun Watson isn't as fast as Griffin, but he can certainly, beat you, with his arm or with his legs. So I think, that game is going to be a lot tougher than a lot of people think. I mean, I know everyone's like, all right, home game, Monday night to kick off the season. The Dome's going to be rocking, and I'm sure it will be. But the Saints have lost their opening game 5 years in a row. They've lost their home opener the past 4 years. So I think, they have a lot of history to overcome. And obviously what happened in the past, doesn't foretell what's going to happen in the future. But certainly, for whatever reason, the Saints have had a really tough time starting the season of late. Mm-hmm. And I think, they're really going to have to find a way to, get off the snide because, the Texans obviously are a good team. And then after that, they play 3 more teams that went to the playoffs. And that was the first thing that struck me. Tough stretch out the gate. You get 4 teams in a row that went to the playoffs. But then after that, it does balance out. And I think some people, always forget. They're always like, oh, the NFL hates the Saints. They gave us right. this, and this. Well, first of all, they're playing a first-place schedule because they won the division last year. So they automatically have to play a couple other NFC division winners. And then, as hard as those first 4 games are, 3 of the next 4 after that are very winnable games against Tampa, Jacksonville. At Chicago will be tough, but then home against the Cardinals, that could be like a 50-point spread. Yeah,
and I think one area where the schedule makers did do the Saints a favor, and to debunk the conspiracy theorists out there, they had a potential to have to play 2 cold weather games on the road, Seattle and Chicago. Both of them are early in the season. They play in Seattle in September, where it's very pleasant, and then you get Chicago at Soldier Field in October. Either one of those could have been a dicey prospect in December if the league was out to get the Saints. They could have put them on the road in back-to-back games in Seattle and Chicago in outdoor environments. They didn't. So, look, these things tend to be cyclical on the schedule. They have a lot of travel. You and I were talking yesterday trying to make our travel arrangements. In the preseason, the Saints play in New York and in L.A. Those are no easy trips. And then they come back early in the year and have to go to L.A. and Seattle. We've talked about they're probably going to stay out on the West Coast, but I think that's in response to all the travel they've got in the preseason as well. I added it up. They'll have over 10, even if they stay on the West Coast between the L.A. and Seattle games in week 2 and 3, they will still log over 10,000 air miles during that month-long stretch. And that's a lot of travel, and that was not the case last year.
Right.
Almost all the games were Dallas, Minnesota, or further east. So these things tend to, what goes around comes around the league when you have to play everybody on the schedule rotation.
It all evens out, and that's a great point to go into. This comment I see from Bridget Tate, who says, it seems the Saints get hit out the gate every year. Well, Bridget, last year the Saints started at home against the Bucks and the Browns, so I don't really think, that's the case.
Looking back, losing that game against the Bucks at home just is mind-boggling. The more you look back at that, how good the Saints were, how Tampa really struggled, that game really does seem like an anomaly.
That's that Fitz magic effect, baby.
That's true.
And now he's going to be in the Dolphins, and we'll get to see him last week of the preseason, although he'll probably be a starter, so he'll probably get to sit that game out. But let's go to some questions from Adam Lane. What concerns looking at depth do you have that might creep up with us on the current team? Any free agents out there that you guys think could come in to start or be starter caliber?
Well, I think Josh and I talk about this all the time. The Saints have fairly good, relatively speaking, good depth across the board, but they've got some indispensable talents, and they really can't afford to lose, like, say, a Mike Thomas. A guy like him, I think, is pretty indispensable. I think the offense would still manage to move the ball, but he is a difference maker that they just don't have anybody behind him. And now you don't have Mark Ingram anymore in the backfield. Alvin Kamara, I think, becomes even more important. Obviously, Drew Brees, but those positions, I think you've got such a singular talent on the roster that depth behind them would be questionable, even though they've got players that can play. I don't think they've got difference makers like those guys. And I don't think they really ever want to lose Marshawn Lattimore at corner for the same reason.
I think you could. I think I wrote something along those lines that if you really considered the most important Saints player, it might be Lattimore, because if you lose Lattimore, that just hurts the secondary in innumerable ways. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not just that you're losing your best cornerback, but his talent helps the safeties so much, and it gives the defensive line a lot more confidence that they're going to have time to rush. So I think you'd probably talk about Brees, obviously, Lattimore, Thomas. And at this point, you could argue Alvin Kamara. I mean, now that they don't have Mark Ingram, I think until we see what Latavius Murray can do in this offense, I think there's going to be a little bit of doubt that he's going to be able to come in and replicate what Mark Ingram was able to do.
I think running back is a definite area that they're not done addressing.
Well, so Sean Payton said on his WWL interview, the one about the Fleur de Lis tattoo, yes, which we can talk about later if anyone wants, or not. He said that they don't view the running back as a must position, but there wasn't a follow-up to that about what he does think the must positions are, so until we know that. But I think a few areas where they could definitely use more depth are defensive end. I mean, right now, their rotation would just be Cam Jordan, Marcus Davenport, and Trey Hendrickson, so I think, obviously they like Trey Hendrickson, but they didn't really use him much last year, so, I don't know, if they find someone, to go ahead of him, then suddenly if he's your fourth guy, you're sitting pretty.
Well, depth at linebacker, I think, because they haven't re-signed very many of these guys.
Sure they did. Right
now I'm looking at A.J. Klein, Alex Anzalone, Demario Davis, Craig Robertson,
Vince Beagle.
I
mean, that's exactly their depth last year. I mean, the only guy that they didn't bring back is Manti Te'o, and he was inactive for most of the games.
Yeah, it just seems like they could use some depth.
Well, I definitely think long term, I wouldn't be surprised if they picked a linebacker, because I mean, you figure Robertson and Beagle are pretty much special teams exclusively. Although Robertson has proven that he can play on defense, but I think that AJ Klein's going into the last year of his deal.
That's a good point.
And Alex Anzalone last year was the first time really in his football career that he played a full season. So I think you sort of have to give yourself a little insurance there. And
this team's got fairly good depth, though.
Yeah.
I mean, they really do. I mean, relatively speaking, NFL, because it's a salary cap league, there's only so much depth you can have, because you got to pay certain starters, certain veterans. So it kind of lends itself to you having holes in your roster. Every team does.
Right. And as for the free agents that they could sign to be starters, no. I mean, the Saints starters are pretty much set in stone. I don't even think there's a single draft pick that they would take that, I would bet on to start this year. I mean, because, obviously second-round pick, can come in and start, but I just don't see really any position unless Nick Easton really struggles and they pick a center that could come in and start right away.
Yeah, I think center's a spot that maybe not a lot of people are thinking about because they brought in Nick Easton. I think it's one they could easily address in the draft.
Because Easton only has guaranteed money for this year, so the Saints might want to get a little insurance there. And Eric Thomas asked, just out of curiosity, when do you guys see the schedule for the first time?
Oh, well, we get it a little early, a little heads up, so our production team here at NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune can put it together. The league gets it to the teams, I think, that day. They don't really leak that thing out very early. They try to keep it hush-hush because they want to make the big unveiling on their TV show. But invariably, things leak out. We have sources around the league. I was able to talk to some people that gave us some individual highlight games, and so we were able to kind of get those out ahead of time. But invariably, we get it a few hours early, and they're able to put it together for our website.
Yeah, and I mean, because once it's sort of, I think all journalists or TV, radio, everyone gets it so that they can be ready for the 7 o'clock announcement. But then once enough people have it, then the word starts to spread. Yeah.
Now, one of the underrated things that inside baseball you all might not find interesting, but it's interesting for us, is because we're able to get a little bit of a head start on the schedule release, we are able to make our travel plans ahead of time. And Josh and I were frantically working on that. And the reason that's important is because once the schedule comes out to the masses at 7 o'clock, fans obviously travel by the thousands. Saints have a huge traveling fan base. I mean, they flood opposing cities on these games, and the hotels fill up quickly. And more importantly than that, though, is the cities themselves gouge their prices when they have a home NFL game. And often the rates go up astronomically within hours after the schedule's released because the managers of the hotels know that's going to be a demand market. So we're able to get a jump on that. We're giving you a little inside baseball. You might not care about that, but it's funny how important that can be, can save over the long haul, because we have, 4 or 5 people travel to every Saints game. By far the largest media party is with NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune. Add that up, 4 or 5 people, 2 nights in every road game. So that's important to us to get the head start.
Well, I apologize to all the listeners out there. I'm sure there's nobody watching this anymore, but, maybe we'll see at the Seattle Renaissance or something in a few months.
We scored good hotel rooms because of Josh.
Let's go back to shout out to Marriott. If anyone from Marriott's watching, I'll take as many points as you can give me. James Richards asks, back to
football.
Back to relevant topics. Can y'all explain the Rick Leonard draft pick to me? I still don't understand it.
Yeah, they took a swing and a miss. I mean, they took a gamble on a guy, and it didn't pay off. I'm with you. Sometimes they do things that make me scratch my head. It reminded me a little bit of the Garrett Grayson pick. When they took Rick Leonard is more of a surprise than that they took him. I mean, I think they could have gotten him in the 6th or 7th round. Same for Garrett Grayson when they took him in the upper 3rd round. That one didn't make sense to me, but this staff and organization has gambled in the past and it's paid off. So you kind of have to put some trust in them. Sometimes they're going to make a mistake like that, but they're not afraid to gamble on a player, a developmental prospect. It just surprised me they took him as high as they did. I remember a few years ago they brought in Jeremy Parnell in undrafted free agency. He was a former basketball player, moved to tackle, was a developmental prospect, and he ends up being a starter in the league. It's a huge contract in Jacksonville, starting in the NFL for years with the Cowboys and Jaguars. That was a similar kind of Rick Leonard project, but they didn't invest as much to take him. But maybe they thought he'd be another Jeremy Parnell.
Yeah, so I think it's always smart to pick an offensive lineman every draft. I just think that, they're so hard to find, right now. I mean, if you talk to any coach, I mean, there are just fewer and fewer good offensive linemen, and especially offensive tackles, because a lot of the best tackles, might try to play tight end or something, if they're athletic enough, or guys, it's also related to the college offenses that these teams are running.
Yep.
I mean, it's so much more complex when they get to the NFL, just because it's a much different blocking scheme. But I just think that you have to sort of take those swings, and sometimes you hit and sometimes you miss. And obviously this was a big miss, but I mean, I don't know that any fourth-round pick that the Saints, could have taken there would have necessarily made the team. I mean, they were so loaded last year and so deep. I mean, they cut 3 other draft picks too. You had Natrell Jamerson, Cameron Moore, and Boston Scott. They cut all those guys.
And they made other rosters.
They did go to other rosters, but I don't think any of them really played.
No, but like Cameron Moore, I know, is still on the Giants roster.
Yeah, and I think Jamerson's still on the Colts, I believe. But regardless, I mean, I just don't think I'm looking at the draft from last year right now. It's not like I see anyone that like, oh my God, the Saints definitely missed out. They should have taken this guy. So, obviously it's not a good pick. Obviously it was a mistake, but at the same time, you just sort of have to, look at the logic behind it. And I think, if you can, if suddenly, if they had more time, if they had a year to keep him on the roster and develop him, maybe he could have, been a useful player, but they didn't have that luxury. And, so now it's just a terrible pick.
I think it speaks more to what Josh said, and that is the supply and demand on offensive tackles in the NFL is decreasing. The supply is decreasing, the demand is increasing because of that. It's hard to find athletic left tackles or right tackles, and they thought maybe this is a diamond in the rough that we can convert, and we end up getting a starting tackle in the middle of the draft. I think that's what the thought process was, and they missed. But I see the logic behind it because it's hard to find tackles. You'll see that in this draft coming up. There's going to be 3 or 4 tackles drafted in the first round that aren't surefire, instant stars in this league, but the position is in such demand, people are going to draft them probably higher than their grade because it's hard to find those guys.
Right. From Adam Lane, and I might this might be the time for Josh's weekly rant, but I'll throw it to Jeff first. Other than Pete, who would be worthy current trade player? Excuse me. Let me read this again. Other than Pete, who would be a worthy current trade player for picks, or who could you see being shipped off for picks or other role players?
On this team?
Yeah.
I mean, the only person I can think of would be someone, I look at their contract, somebody that might be nearing the end of their contract with the Saints that they would want to move. Maybe like a Larry Warford or somebody, but I think they like him too much. So, I have to look at something like that, but I don't think there's really anybody that would merit a draft pick. I mean, in the past, I would have said Mark Ingram. Here you got Alvin Kamara coming up. You're probably not going to pay breakout money to Mark Ingram. That's the kind of guy you can trade because he's still got value. He's still healthy. Some teams would want him. The Saints don't have very many of those guys. They've either got bona fide stars they can't afford to trade, or they've got guys that don't have the value that or depth at that position that would entice another team.
Yeah, I mean, as much as the Saints always want to be active on the trade market, like Jeff said, they just don't have desirable assets.
I thought of one. Maybe Teddy Bridgewater.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah. If a team gets a starter hurt this year, he becomes a valuable trade chip.
Yeah, exactly. If he plays well in the preseason, guy gets hurt, around the league, all of a sudden, if the Saints could either recoup that third-round pick or, maybe even something a little better, I think that would make sense. But what I was going to say, and I won't go on a rant, but they're not trading Andres Pete. I don't know who out there brainwashed so many Saints fans to thinking that they're going to trade Andres Pete or that they should trade Andres Pete. It doesn't make any sense. If you trade Andres Pete, you get worse at left guard and you get worse at your backup left tackle. And the Saints are in win-now mode. Those are 2 positions that you can't afford to hurt yourself. And also, it wouldn't make any sense for other teams to acquire a guy, with his $9.5 million cap figure.
And he's going to be available next year.
And he's going to become, and he's only on a 1-year deal. So, for the most part, teams don't trade much for a guy who's on an expiring contract. And it wouldn't really make much sense for the Saints. I mean, the Saints went in; they already lost Max Unger.
Well,
you can't afford to lose 2 of your starters.
Max Unger makes it even less likely you trade Pete because now you're bringing in Easton, who isn't as familiar with this offense at all. Unger knew it like the back of his hand, and is not as powerful as Max Unger. One of the scouting report on Easton's a very smart guy, pretty athletic, not overpowering at the point of attack. So you're going to want Andres Pete and Larry Warford, a couple of brawlers next to him to help compensate for his lack of power inside. So it makes it even less likely you deal Pete.
I mean, I guess, if Ken Crawley plays well in the preseason, similar to Bridgewater, team loses a cornerback, they might want to trade for him. But I just don't see them making a deal before the draft. At least not one including a player. I could see them obviously shipping off future picks to get picks this year, or packaging some of their late round picks to move up, just a little bit. Because, I wrote something last week. I mean, it's going to be hard for any Saints rookie to come in and contribute much. So I think, the way they should be approaching this draft is that it's probably going to be like last year, where a lot of late round picks are going to be in jeopardy of not making the roster. So it might make a lot of sense for them to package, those picks that they have in the last 3 rounds. And if they could, change 5 picks into like 2 picks or something, that might be smart if they see someone they like.
I think this draft is positioned for the Saints to maybe take some gambles on some developmental prospects, some small school guys, or someone that doesn't have a lot of football experience, because they're in a position where they don't need, just like Josh said, they don't need help right away at any position. So they can take an Akeem Hicks type of player, a guy from a small school that might take 2 or 3 years to develop, and look what happens down the road. He ends up being a bona fide starter. I could see them doing that this year along the lines, especially because their lines are getting up there a little bit. Some of the guys, you could see them take some offensive linemen. I think that's an area that I would definitely think they'll address in this draft, because of the current group will be running out of salary. Their salaries will be up in a year or 2 down the line, and you could have some ready-made starters.
So Akeem Hicks became a star for the Bears. Rob Ninkovich became a star for the Pats. Where does this guy that you're projecting eventually become a star?
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, how big men are. I've always told people, Saints fans like to ride on Akeem Hicks when he was here, at least a certain group of Saints fans. Akeem Hicks was good. You could see the talent. He had some games where he dominated with the Saints. He just wasn't consistent, and I believe he wasn't getting coached that well. I think if Akeem Hicks what's his name, Brian McNeil?
Ryan
Nielsen.
Ryan Nielsen, yeah.
If he were under Ryan Nielsen, I think he would have developed a lot quicker and maybe been a Pro Bowl player here. So sometimes you have to look at the coaching, and I think Sean Payton did. It's one of the reasons he overhauled the coaching, to determine why guys like Malcolm Jenkins end up having huge or better careers on another team than they did where your team was. It's not necessarily the player's fault.
But sometimes it is.
Sometimes it is. It's hard to read.
Sure.
Sometimes. Sometimes players develop late, though, especially big men. Look at Cameron Jordan's career. He's the prime example. What, he had 1 sack his rookie year, played every game, and had 1 sack. And look at him now. He's a double-digit guy. He wasn't even a double-digit guy his first 2 or 3 years. It took him a while.
And I had an old GM that I used to cover, Martin Mayhew with the Lions, used to say that if a guy doesn't show it in his first 3 years, he probably doesn't have it. Mm-hmm. So, it makes sense, that the Saints, were willing to get rid of these guys, even if, they ended up being proven wrong. Matthew Stanford, who every time I see his question, I think it says Matthew Stafford, and I get a little confused. What happened with Ziggy Ansah? Well, so far nothing. There were concerns about his shoulder. He missed most of the last season and underwent shoulder surgery. So I know the Saints and Bills brought him in for a visit, but you don't want to sign a guy who's still hurt. That's to anyone out there who wants to ask about Dez Bryant. Also Jarris Bird. So you don't want to sign a guy who is already hurt. So from the Saints' perspective, I would imagine that Ziggy Ansah isn't going to sign anywhere until after the draft.
Right.
If teams address their defensive end need, then they won't be wanting Ziggy Ansah. But if they fail to, then all of a sudden it makes it a lot easier to take that risk on a guy who has dealt with injuries for most of his career.
And he becomes probably more affordable too. The longer he sits on the market, the lower his price tag is going to be. I think he and his agent probably went into free agency thinking they were going to get a certain amount, and the reality is set in now. And no one's going to sign him, I think, now until the draft is over and see how the roster shakes out across the league. But he's a guy I could see signing right before the start of training camp. And I think he's a good fit here. They don't have to have a pass rusher, but they need a third guy, I think, to rotate in with Cam Jordan and with Marcus Davenport. I think he'd be a great fit, and there's obviously an interest, so it makes a lot of sense. But he's got to get healthy first. We don't know how bad his shoulder is.
All right, let's go back and talk about the schedule a little bit more, just because it's fresh. Jeff, I'm pretty excited about that Week 15 Monday night game against the Colts. As I know, is Ryan Wilson at the end of our table, one of our video and digital media producers. But I mean, Luck versus Brees is about as good of a matchup as you can hope for, right?
Well, yeah, and I mentioned this in my observations today. That's a sneaky tough stretch there late in the season. Everybody's focused on that opening stretch, but that's when they go to Atlanta for Thanksgiving Day. That will not be easy. It's never easy in Atlanta. It's always a dogfight. And then I think they come back home and play the 49ers, who I think are going to be vastly improved with Jimmy Garoppolo. They've got a ton of draft picks. They had good free agency.
And the Saints struggled with that Falcons offense when Kyle Shanahan was in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so now he's the coach at the Niners.
And then you got Luck. And, after that, and then you go to Tennessee, which is a place they're not familiar with, and a tough team. That's the kind of team I think that gives the Saints a lot of problems. I think those 4 games are all difficult because they're playing good quarterbacks in most of them as well. And teams are unfamiliar with. So I think that late stretch, they're going to want to make hay in the middle of their schedule.
Yeah.
They want to be in good position when they go to Atlanta on Thanksgiving Day.
Yeah, but I think everyone, when these things come out, there's this urge to point out, I said this earlier, that the NFL, always wants to, make things hard for the Saints, and they give them the hardest schedule and yada, yada, yada. Well, one thing, I have to double check this, but I do think they play the most playoff teams of anyone else, and that has nothing to do with the NFL. That's just the way things work out because your matchups are determined based on A, where you finished, and B, whatever divisional matchups you have. So the Saints got they get 2 division winners just because they were a division winner. And then the 2 divisions that they have to play every team are the NFC West, which had 2 playoff teams, the Rams and the Seahawks, and then the AFC South, which had 2 playoff teams with the Colts and the Texans. So right. I think that's going to make things pretty tough. But, we always look at these things and say they're hard or easy in April, but then all of a sudden, 3 weeks into the season, oh, my God, the schedule looks so easier. Right. Oh, my God, the Panthers are the best team in the NFL. The Saints still have to play them twice. So we don't know anything. My prediction for the schedule, based on what I've seen, is that the Saints will go somewhere between 16-0 and 0-16. I wouldn't bet my life on it, but that's my guess.
The Snarknado is in the house. But, look, Peter King has covered this schedule thing a lot in his it used to be his Monday morning quarterback column. And he's talked about how the computer that puts together the NFL schedule, I think, spits out like 56,000 different schedules, entire NFL schedules, because you've got 32 teams, and they're trying to please all 32 teams. Everybody's got like certain requests that they try to adhere to. Well, you put that times 32, it's not easy. And so they try to come up with one that's also going to please their network TV partners, and also now we got streaming network partners. Everybody's got to say so, and it's not going to be perfect for everybody. Mm-hmm. So it's a difficult thing. No one's sitting there, the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, trying to screw the Saints. I know that's hard to believe, but they're trying to make it good for everybody. And I think the schedule is just fine for the Saints. I think they got 4 primetime games. That keeps them high profile. I think they had 5 last year.
They only have 1 Thursday game?
Right, only have 1 Thursday game, and they're pretty spread out. I think they have a couple of 2-game road trips, but none of these 3-game trips. I think they had one last year, which is very unusual. And they get home games to start and end the season.
No, they're on the road at Carolina.
Oh, that's right, Carolina. That's right. Because that's the one game that could be cold. I look it up. They've finished there before.
Yeah.
But it's usually like in the upper 40s, low 50s. So really no cold weather games. I know the Saints actually are built better for cold weather than they used to be, but for the reporters there, we always enjoy not having to be out in the cold weather.
The press box is heated, so I don't really care.
Yeah,
I just feel bad for our photographers that have to.
That's what I'm thinking of my teammates.
Okay.
Team player.
Eric Thomas.
Moving on.
Eric Thomas says, putting you on the spot. You ready?
Yes.
Is Week 15 Brees' last regular season game?
Regular season home game?
That's what it says.
It's got to be home game.
No.
That's what he's thinking. Can't be a regular season game.
I think he
must have left out. Eric left out home. That's an interesting question.
It's definitely his last regular season home game of the season. I think he's asking if that's his last regular season game ever. I think he's saying that they could clinch the playoffs by then, and that this could be Brees' last season.
Wow.
Me and Eric are on the same wavelength. Unless we're not, then I apologize.
No, yeah, I don't know. I think this could be Brees' last year. I've never felt that way ever at all before. But I've just felt more so this offseason than ever that this could be it for him. And don't ask me why. There's nothing. Nobody said anything. I think the fact that they haven't signed him and there's been no discussion about signing him at all to an extension kind of gives me a little bit of pause. I know he keeps saying I'm on a year-to-year deal, playing year-to-year, but it just feels like there's a little different air to his career this offseason. And the way he finished last year, that Rams game was the first time I've ever watched Drew Brees, and I thought, man, he's just not – I don't know. There's something – he's not getting it done. It was the first time I've ever felt that way ever. I mean, I've seen him miss throws before, but this just felt different. That long throw he made to Ted Ginn Jr. that got them down there to potentially win the game right before the no call was kind of a duck. Mm-hmm. It was kind of a miracle that the Rams didn't knock it down. And that was the only really significant throw he completed in the second half. So, again, maybe he was wearing down. Maybe he was injured. We don't know. But it definitely looked different. Looked like a different Drew Brees in that game.
So Eric said he did mean, his last regular season game in the Dome. Okay. I mean, I don't know. I think my inclination is certainly to say yes. I mean, Drew has said, before he signed this most recent 2-year deal, he said that he wanted to go year to year. But I agree. I mean, I think, late in the season last year, we did start to see some signs of decline. Now, that's not necessarily all because of Drew. I mean, I do think defenses started to figure the Saints out a little bit, and we knew that there was going to be regression at some point because their offense was scoring at a historic pace, and, there are some smart coaches in the NFL that eventually figure it out, and I think the Cowboys definitely gave other teams a blueprint. But, I mean, I think there will certainly be a different air in the Dome that day. I think it'll be, I think there will be a lot of people wondering, the same thing as Eric. And even though Drew, probably won't acknowledge, his plans at that point, because I certainly wouldn't expect, even if he does come back, I imagine it'll be another off-season, 1-year deal,
right?
Where it sort of makes the Saints sit and wait and decide. But I definitely think there's a chance that could be, and they're probably going to try to make it a very special occasion. And it's certainly fitting to have it, him against Luck. Two guys, that maybe dealt with shoulder problems earlier in their career, and certainly have incredible career trajectories. We'll see if Luck ever manages to get to the level that Drew has. But, I mean, I guess it's something I hadn't considered, but it would make sense.
I think we'll get a better feel for Brees. I know this is kind of Captain Obvious, but, once the season gets going, we see how he performs and how the Saints perform. If they have another great season, I think he's more inclined to stay. But if things were to fall apart or, they have a really bad year and he does not perform very well, who knows? It's hard to read the tea leaves on that. He also might be the kind of guy that's wired to say, I don't want to go out that way. But I think a lot's going to come down to how he performs. And the Drew Brees through the first 12 weeks of the season was as good as I've ever seen him. But the last month and a half, he didn't look quite as good. And I don't know if, like what Josh said, I don't know if there's a reason for that or they were just playing better defenses. There are a lot of things they had to do. So I'm really interested to see how he plays this season early on.
Well, here's a big question, for the Saints, and I'll throw it to you. I don't know if you've thought about this. Do you think Mike Thomas will sign a new contract before we know what Drew's plans are?
No, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I would think he will stay here. They value him. They're going to throw some money at him, I think. But it's going to be difficult to pay him and Brees, and you got Cam Jordan, I think, coming up, right? He's got, 2 more years?
He's got 2 more years, but they need to pay him now. I mean, he is
right,
vast.
He's underpaid.
He's so underpaid.
And he. I mean, I wrote about this last year. I mean, the most underrated thing about Cam Jordan is his durability. I mean, the guy he hardly ever misses a snap, much less a game. That's hard to do at defensive end. Those are the kind of guys you pay because they're on the field every game. And so is Mike Thomas. I mean, he plays through a lot. He's had a bunch of little nicks and dinged injuries. They've got a lot of guys like that. Alvin Kamara, he's had some concussions, but he's out there every week. And so that's an area that I think the Saints have actually improved. And on a side note, the Pelicans introduced their new director of basketball operations yesterday. One of the scuttlebutt I heard out there is that they might be changing out their training staff because they've had a bunch of injuries lately. That's a huge thing for a lot of executives. When you're paying players exorbitant amount of money, you got to get them on the court, on the field, and that hadn't been the case with the Pelicans as well. So I think you'll see a change to the training staff, much the way Sean Payton and Mickey Loomis did to the football training staff.
But isn't the Pelicans training staff the one that the Saints used to have?
Well, some of them were. They were the kind of secondary guys. But, yeah, I mean, that's something that David Griffin made a point yesterday of saying he thinks it's incredibly important. The performance of the players and the health and care for the players is high on his priority list. And we all know that's been a problem for the Pelicans, and it was a problem for the Saints for a long time, and it's turned around, at least with their key players. We know Terron Armstead's he's been the one guy that's been, I would consider, an indispensable player in a lot of ways that has suffered a lot of injuries back-to-back years, but they've had depth at tackle that's allowed them to absorb it.
Yeah. All right, last question, another one from Matthew Stanford/Stafford. I'm just going to keep pretending that Matt Stafford's asking us questions.
I bet he gets that all the time, don't you? I mean, he has to.
Only in writing.
I think I would go by Matt if I were to have a name that close. I would go by Matt.
All right.
Well, Matt, though.
We don't want to tell you how to live your life, Matthew.
I would do to everybody else.
Yeah, that's a good point. But nobody likes it when you do. I would think with only 3 defensive ends and 3 safeties on the current roster, those would be draft or free agent priorities. Safety, defensive end.
Well, I don't know how they feel about is JT Gray, right?
Yep.
As a young guy that they kind of liked. We were kind of puzzled. At least I was surprised they kept him last year. You'd been here, and they liked him a lot.
They love him on special teams. Apparently he used to, as the kids say, give Justin Hardy that work in practice.
What does that mean?
I think we all know what that means.
Yeah, look, I don't know. I think Josh and I, one of the things we do agree on is that Marcus Williams did not have a very good season last year. He had a kind of a sophomore slump for whatever reason. He's got talent. How they view him, I don't think we really truly know. They always praise him publicly. They're never going to throw a player under the bus anyway, but I thought he was pretty bad in some games last year. He's a guy that, maybe they see him as a declining player, and they may secretly want to draft a free safety. I think they're in pretty good shape. It's strong safety, but Von Bell will be up, right?
Yeah, his last year of Von Bell's deal.
So, yeah, I think you're right. I think that's an area that might be a sneaky need that we're not talking about.
Certainly. No. I think both of those would make sense with the second-round pick. And I do think, though, that if they draft a safety in the second round, a lot of fans are going to be like, oh, great, we finally got one. But that guy's not going to play very much this year. I think they're still going to keep Marcus Williams and Von Bell as the starters. And really, a few years ago they did a lot of 3 safety sets, but now that they have, more reliable nickel cornerbacks, I don't think that, they're going to be doing much of that. But certainly I think with Von Bell's contract coming up, with Marcus Williams not, elevating his game last season, I do think, a safety would be a long-term fit, but I do think JT Gray could certainly make the roster, especially for special teams. Obviously, Chris Banjo is going to be around, and I think he could be a fine top backup option. We talked about defensive end earlier. I definitely think they need one, but whether that guy, it's really if it's a second-round pick, I think that guy could come in and leapfrog Trey Hendrickson right away. But if it's somewhere later, I think you're going to see Trey Hendrickson start the season as the number 3 guy. So we will find out. All of these things and more. The draft is just a week away, so get ready. We'll listen to all your predictions. We'll have plenty of content at NOLA.com, and we will talk to you next week.
Thanks for joining us.